Marcus Licinius Crassus was, without dispute, the richest man in all of Rome. His wealth was staggering, vast estates stretching across Italy, countless slaves working his lands, and an empire of profits built on real estate speculation, confiscated properties, and ruthless business dealings. Yet despite his immense fortune and position as one of the three rulers of Rome in the First Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, Crassus lived under the shadow of his more celebrated partners. Caesar's conquests in Gaul had filled the streets of Rome with tales of his brilliance as a general. Pompey's domination of the Mediterranean had cemented his image as a naval hero and protector of the Republic. Crassus, meanwhile, was remembered not for sweeping military victories, but for his insatiable greed and his infamous suppression of the Spartacus slave revolt, a campaign marred by brutality and shared credit. The Roman public and Senate saw him as a banker among warriors, a man whose influence came from gold rather than glory. For years, Crassus had endured the quiet humiliation of being the third wheel of the triumvirate. In Rome's culture, where military triumphs were the highest currency of honor, his riches meant little without the blood-earned prestige of conquest. At 60 years old, an age when most men would have gladly retired into luxury, Crassus still burned with ambition. He wanted more than wealth. He wanted his name etched in marble alongside Rome's greatest commanders. His gaze turned eastward, toward the Parthian Empire. Sprawling from the Euphrates to the Indus River, Parthia was a land of unimaginable riches. Gold and silver beyond counting, silks that shimmered like water in sunlight, and spices so rare they could ransom a king. It was also a prize no Roman general had yet claimed, a frontier unconquered, a glory unearned. Crassus convinced himself that an invasion of Parthia would not only match Caesar's Gaul and Pompey's Mediterranean, but surpass them both. It would make him the man who brought Rome into the riches of the East. He imagined parading through the streets in a triumphal procession, his soldiers weighed down with captured treasure, his enemies' kings in chains before him. In his mind, the conquest would be quick, decisive, and immensely profitable. Yet this vision was not born of necessity, nor of a threat from Parthia. It was pure ambition, an unprovoked war waged for personal glory and wealth. Crassus ignored the whispers that such a campaign was reckless, that the Parthians were no mere desert rabble but masters of cavalry and strategy. He saw only the glitter of gold and the laurels of victory, never the shadows that would follow. In the summer heat of Rome, beneath marble colonnades and the watchful eyes of statues of past conquerors, Marcus Licinius Crassus began plotting the campaign that would either crown him in everlasting glory or lead him into the most infamous death in the history of the Republic. The year was 55 BCE, and Marcus Licinius Crassus had secured his appointment as governor of the wealthy province of Syria. To most men, it was a position to consolidate influence and enjoy the fruits of office. But to Crassus, Syria was a launchpad, a gateway to the east, and the conquest he believed would cement his name in the annals of Roman glory. The Senate had refused to grant him a formal declaration of war against Parthia, wary of provoking a powerful neighbor without just cause. Yet Crassus was not a man to let legality stand in the way of ambition. Ignoring the protests of more cautious voices, he began preparations for an invasion on a scale rarely seen in Rome's eastern campaigns. Over the next months, he assembled a formidable force. 7 full legions, more than 40,000 disciplined legionaries, supported by 4,000 cavalry and an equal number of light infantry. It was an army designed to overwhelm by sheer numbers, the kind of display that would strike awe into the hearts of Rome's allies and enemies alike. The banners of each legion fluttered in the Syrian wind, the crimson and gold catching the desert sun. Among his officers was his beloved son, Publius Crassus. In contrast to his father's reputation as a financier and politician, Publius was a proven soldier, hardened under the command of Julius Caesar during the Gallic Wars, where he had led cavalry charges and returned with victories to his name. His presence added not only military skill but a sense of legacy. This was to be the campaign that would secure the Crassus name for generations. Father and son together, carving out a new eastern dominion for Rome. Crassus saw the Parthian Empire as both vulnerable and ripe for plunder. Reports reached him of unrest within the Parthian court, of border defenses stretched thin. In his mind, this was not a gamble, it was an inevitability. He envisioned columns of gold and silver carried west, exotic silks and spices flowing into Rome's markets, and his own triumph celebrated with the spoils of the East. The conquest would not only match Caesar's Gallic laurels and Pompey's naval victories, it would surpass them. Yet beneath the glittering vision lay shadows he refused to see. Parthia's armies were not the disorganized bands of desert raiders he imagined, but masters of mobile warfare, their cataphracts and horse archers unmatched in the open plains. Seasoned Roman officers cautioned him, warning of the dangers of fighting in a land where water was scarce, supply lines long, and the enemy could strike from nowhere. Crassus dismissed them as cowards, convinced that Roman discipline and engineering had crushed all foes before, and would do so again. As the legions drilled in the Syrian heat, their shields gleaming and spears standing in perfect ranks, Crassus looked eastward across the Euphrates. He believed he was on the threshold of immortality. In truth, he was stepping onto the road to Carrhae. In the spring of 53 BCE, Marcus Licinius Crassus led his legions eastward across the Euphrates River. The crossing was smooth, and the first days of the campaign brought quick victories. Small settlements fell with little resistance, and the Roman siege engines, gleaming in the sun, made short work of the few fortified towns they encountered. To Crassus, it was confirmation that his gamble had been the right one. Parthia seemed fragile, unprepared for the might of Rome. But the ease of those first encounters was an illusion, a trap woven with precision by a man far younger but infinitely more cunning. Surinna, the commander of the Parthian forces. Barely 30 years old, Surinna was already a legend in his own land, charismatic, calculating, and a master of the open battlefield. His plan was simple in principle, devastating in execution. Lure the Romans deeper into the desert, far from their supply lines, until heat, exhaustion, and doubt became as deadly as arrows. The Parthians did not meet the legions in a decisive pitched battle. Instead, they appeared only at the edges of sight, distant riders on the horizon, banners fluttering in the wind, vanishing the moment Roman scouts approached. At night, the watch reported strange movements in the dunes, the sound of hooves on sand, and the eerie whistle of arrows loosed in the dark. There was never a clear enemy to fight, only the constant, gnawing sense of being watched. The army Crassus had brought was built for set-piece battles, with heavy infantry at its core, an unstoppable force when it could close ranks and crush its opponents with shield and sword. But here, in the wide, pitiless spaces of Mesopotamia, such formations meant little. Surinna's forces were built for speed and flexibility. Heavy cataphracts clad in glittering scales of bronze and iron, their lances capable of shattering a man and his shield in a single charge. And the feared Parthian horse archers, who could loose arrows at a full gallop, hitting targets from distances the Romans had never faced. Surinna understood the terrain as intimately as he understood warfare. He had trained his men to strike and vanish, never giving the Romans a chance to retaliate. Supply convoys were harassed until they broke apart. Stragglers were picked off by small raiding parties. Even the strongest legionaries began to weaken under the relentless sun, their armor growing heavier with each passing hour. Crassus, frustrated and unwilling to admit the danger, pressed on. Every step forward was meant to bring him closer to a decisive battle, yet each mile only took his army deeper into the trap. The desert was no longer a road to victory. It had become Surinna's weapon, grinding down the will and strength of Rome's finest before a single full engagement had even taken place. The hunt had begun, and in the vast silence of the Mesopotamian desert, it was the hunter, not the invader, who set the rules of the game. June 9, 53 BCE. The sun rose over the dry plains outside the city of Carrhae, burning away the last traces of cool night air. Crassus, determined to force a decisive engagement, deployed his army in the time-honored Roman formation. The heavy infantry in the center, a wall of shields and spears, cavalry positioned on both wings, and light troops screening the front. The banners of Rome caught the morning light, and for a moment, it looked as though discipline and order would carry the day. Then, in the shimmering distance, Surina appeared. His army was unlike anything the Romans had faced, a force made entirely of cavalry, moving as if with one mind. In the center rode the cataphracts, heavy horsemen encased in scales of gleaming bronze and iron, their lances long and deadly. Around them flowed the horse archers, darting and weaving like water, their movements impossibly fast for the Roman eye to follow. The Parthian assault began with a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, the sharp, whistling hiss of thousands of arrows in flight. They fell in great waves, rattling against shields, punching through armor, striking men in the gaps between plates. The Romans had faced archers before, but never with this kind of endurance. Surina had prepared supply trains loaded with fresh arrows, ferried to the front on camels, ensuring that his horse archers could maintain their relentless barrage hour after hour without pause. At first, the Romans held their formation, shields locked together, the testudo absorbing much of the storm. But the weight of their armor, the heat of the day, and the unending rain of missiles began to erode their strength. Men collapsed from wounds and exhaustion. Their shields grew heavy with embedded shafts. And worst of all, there was no enemy within striking distance. On the right wing, Publius Crassus, eager to prove himself and turn the tide, saw an opportunity, or what he believed to be one. A contingent of Parthian cataphracts seemed isolated, their ranks thin. Ignoring pleas for caution, Publius spurred his cavalry forward, leading a fierce charge that crashed into the enemy's armored line. For a heartbeat, the clash was glorious, steel against steel, the ground trembling beneath the hooves. But it was exactly what Surina had intended. The heavy cavalry absorbed the impact while horse archers swept in from all sides, encircling Publius's force. Cut off from the main army, surrounded, and showered with arrows from every direction, the young commander's men fell in droves. When the last of his guard was cut down, Publius himself was slain. Surina, ever the master of psychological warfare, ordered the young man's head severed and mounted on a spear. It was carried back to the Roman lines, held high for all to see. Crassus froze. The sight of his son's lifeless face, swaying above the enemy ranks, shattered his composure. The commander who had once dreamed of Eastern glory now stood hollow-eyed. The battlefield at Carrhae had fallen silent, save for the occasional cry of the wounded and the whinny of horses in the distance. Marcus Licinius Crassus stood in the fading light, his face pale beneath the grime and sweat. The sight of his son's severed head still haunted his eyes, and the unbreakable will that had carried him across the Euphrates was gone. Night was falling, and with it came the decision that no Roman general wanted to make: retreat. The once proud legions were shattered, their formation broken, their confidence destroyed. The desert air, which had been blistering with heat during the day, now turned bitter cold. Men shivered in their armor, their bodies worn down by thirst, fatigue, and wounds. The order was given quietly, almost shamefully: withdraw to Carrhae under cover of darkness. The hope was that the Parthians, content with their victory, would not press the attack in the night. But the retreat was anything but orderly. In the dim starlight, Roman discipline dissolved into chaos. Soldiers stumbled over the bodies of their comrades. The wounded begged to be carried, but many were left behind. Canteens were dry. The desperate licked dew from their armor. Every shadow seemed to hold an enemy. Every gust of wind carried the imagined thrum of approaching hooves. The Parthian cavalry was never far. They struck without warning. Small raiding parties galloping into the column, cutting down stragglers, then vanishing into the darkness. Panic spread. Some soldiers threw away their shields to run faster. Others collapsed in the sand, too weak to rise again. Officers shouted themselves hoarse trying to keep order, but even the most hardened veterans could feel the fear tightening around their throats. By the time the survivors reached the gates of Carrhae, they were scarcely recognizable as the force that had crossed the Euphrates with such confidence. Half their number was gone. Dead, captured, or left behind in the desert. The survivors' armor was dented, their cloaks in tatters, their eyes hollow from exhaustion and loss. Inside the city, They slumped against walls and collapsed in the streets, too tired even to remove their helmets. And then came the final twist. Surena, the Parthian commander, did not press the attack. Instead, he sent envoys under a white flag. His offer was deceptively generous. Lay down arms, agree to terms, and the Roman army would be allowed to withdraw safely back to their own territory. To some, it sounded like hope, an end to the nightmare. To others, it reeked of deception. But Crassus, beaten and grieving, clung to the possibility that not all was lost. Perhaps, if he accepted, some part of his army could be saved. The truth, though, was already written in the dust of the desert. Rome had been broken at Carrhae, and the man who had once dreamed of conquering the East now stood on the edge of surrender, his legacy crumbling as quickly as his army. The offer seemed like the only lifeline left. After days of humiliation, thirst, and loss, Surena's envoys arrived under a white flag, their horses draped in silk and their tone deceptively courteous. They carried an invitation for Marcus Licinius Crassus to meet the Parthian commander in person, to discuss honorable terms for the Roman withdrawal. Crassus's senior officers were deeply suspicious. They argued in hushed but urgent tones. Nothing about this war had been honorable, and Surena was far too cunning to simply let the Romans walk away. "It's a trap," some insisted. "He'll seize you the moment you leave the walls." But Crassus, beaten down by defeat and grief, could not bring himself to believe that every last avenue was closed. The thought of salvaging even a fragment of his army and his reputation was too tempting. And so, against the warnings of those who still had the will to resist, Crassus agreed. The meeting was arranged on a stretch of flat, barren ground between the two camps, a so-called neutral zone. Both sides would come with only a small escort. The symbolism was meant to suggest mutual respect. In truth, it was the perfect stage for treachery. The morning of the meeting, the sky was the pale gold of early dawn. Crassus rode out from Carrhae with a handful of his senior officers, his crimson cloak trailing behind him, the desert wind carrying the scent of dust and iron. Across the flat expanse, Surena approached with his own retinue, tall, broad-shouldered Parthian nobles in gleaming scale armor, their horses adorned with intricate silver harnesses. At first, the exchange was polite. Formal greetings were given. Words of peace floated into the air. But the mood shifted almost imperceptibly. Voices rose. Gestures grew sharper. Accounts differ. Some say a Parthian noble insulted Crassus, others that a Roman officer made an aggressive move. But the outcome was the same. In a sudden blur of motion, the Parthians closed in. Shouts erupted. Roman hands reached for weapons, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Horses surged forward. Sand churned under pounding hooves, and within moments the negotiation dissolved into chaos. Crassus was seized from the saddle, his arms pinned. Around him, his escort was dragged down or cut off, the dust rising thick enough to sting the eyes. When the tumult subsided, the reality was clear. The richest man in Rome, the commander of one of the largest armies ever sent east, was now a prisoner of his enemy. He was no longer the imperious statesman who had crossed the Euphrates with dreams of conquest. He was a captive, stripped of power and dignity. To the Parthians, this was not simply the capture of a general, it was the symbolic conquest of an idea. Crassus embodied Roman greed, arrogance, and the belief that the East could be taken like a merchant's purse. Now that ambition had been humbled, bound, and placed under the watch of the man who had orchestrated Rome's greatest eastern defeat. For Surena, the capture of Marcus Licinius Crassus was not the end. It was the moment to deliver a punishment worthy of the man's crimes. This was no ordinary enemy general. To the Parthians, Crassus represented the very soul of Roman arrogance. An unprovoked invader who crossed the Euphrates not for Rome's safety or honor, but for the glitter of gold and the pride of glory. His defeat was a military triumph. His death, Surena decided, would be a lesson. In the Parthian camp, preparations began. Artisans brought a large bronze crucible and stoked the fires until the heat shimmered in the air. Into the vessel went gold coins, jewelry, ornaments, slowly melting into a molten, glowing liquid. The temperature climbed past 1,000 degrees, the surface of the metal swirling with an almost hypnotic beauty, hiding its lethal nature. Crassus was brought forward under heavy guard. He was forced to kneel on the packed desert earth, his crimson cloak dusty and torn, his wrists bound tightly. Before him, a semicircle of Parthian nobles sat mounted on their horses, their armor catching the orange gleam of firelight. Behind them stood rows of captured Roman soldiers, silent and grim, forced to witness what was about to happen. Surina addressed the gathering in a voice loud enough for both friend and foe to hear. He spoke of how Crassus had crossed into Parthian lands without cause, driven only by greed. He spoke of how such greed corrupted the spirit and brought ruin, not just to the guilty man but to all who followed him. Then, in a deliberate, cutting gesture, he pointed to the crucible. 2 soldiers stepped forward, gripping Crassus's head and forcing his jaw open. The molten gold was poured slowly, its liquid fire cascading into his mouth. The searing heat burned through flesh and bone, racing down his throat, igniting a white-hot agony that no human could endure without screaming. Yet the gold silenced him instantly, choking his final cry. His body convulsed, but the soldiers held him firm, ensuring that the execution was both prolonged and visible to all. The symbolism was as sharp as the pain. All his life, Crassus had worshipped gold. It had bought his influence, shaped his ambitions, and ultimately lured him into the fatal sands of Mesopotamia. Now, gold was not his reward, but his destruction. When it was over, the Parthian nobles remained still, as if committing the image to memory. The Romans who survived would carry this vision back across the Euphrates, their words spreading the tale through the streets of Rome. In time, it would become legend, that the man who valued gold above all else died with it searing his insides. Surina had delivered his message, not just to Rome but to all who might one day look east with conquest in mind. The molten gold cooled and hardened, a grotesque relic of ambition's final price. And in the silence that followed, the empire's richest man lay lifeless, forever bound to the metal that had ruled his fate. News of Marcus Licinius Crassus's death crossed the Euphrates faster than any Roman legion could march. In the streets of Rome, the tale spread in whispers at first, then in public shouts. The richest man in the Republic, the general who had promised to bring Parthia to its knees, was gone. And not just gone humiliated, executed in a manner so cruel and symbolic that it left even Rome's hard-hearted senators uneasy. The impact was immediate and devastating. For centuries, Rome had cultivated an image of invincibility. Legion after legion had conquered lands from the misty isles of Britannia to the deserts of Africa, breaking kingdoms and absorbing them into the Republic's growing empire. But now, in the Mesopotamian desert, that aura had been shattered. The Parthians had not only destroyed one of the largest armies ever sent east, they had annihilated its commander in a way designed to burn itself into history. The political consequences were just as catastrophic. The first triumvirate, the fragile alliance between Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus, was broken beyond repair. Crassus had been the balancing force between 2 ambitious men, his immense wealth and influence keeping Caesar and Pompey from open conflict. With him gone, nothing stood between their rivalry and outright civil war. Within a few short years, Rome would descend into chaos, and the Republic would fall to the rise of a single ruler. For the Parthians, Crassus's fate was more than a personal victory. It was a warning carved in fire and gold. They had shown that even Rome, with all its legions and its arrogance, could be humbled. The molten gold execution became a story told in markets, courts, and military camps throughout the East. A tale to dissuade would-be conquerors, historians, philosophers, and moralists seized upon the symbolism. Plutarch would later write that Crassus's greed was his undoing, that the gold he worshipped had become the instrument of his destruction. For others, it was a timeless cautionary tale. The thing one covets most can be the very thing that kills you. Roman playwrights and poets turned the event into tragic drama, some painting Crassus as a victim of hubris, others as the architect of his own downfall and the decades that followed. The name Crassus was invoked as a warning in military councils, whispered in the ears of generals who dreamed of Eastern conquest. Archaeologists in later centuries would find the remnants of the Carrhae battlefield, shattered Roman armor, arrowheads, and coins, silent witnesses to the disaster. The molten gold, whether literal or legend, outlived the man himself. It became an enduring metaphor for the perils of unchecked ambition. Even today, the story resonates. Wealth without wisdom leads to ruin, and the pursuit of glory without restraint can destroy not just a man, but an empire. In the end, Crassus's legacy was not the new province he sought to win for Rome, but the bitter lesson of his fall, a lesson forged in greed.